topic we've talked about, topic I've talked about to a number of groups over the past several months. And each time I've realized that people aren't necessarily familiar with all of the tools that WERC has to offer its members and the industry. WERC as an organization really exists for the purpose of eradicating bad warehouses. You know, that's the gist of a very well-written mission statement that we have. And so to that end, over the last several years, we've developed different products and services to help with that. Certainly benchmarking and metrics is very important to what you all do, and so it's a big focus of what WERC does as well. So let's go ahead and get started here. You know, I'd like to say this is a quote that was heard around the world. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Unfortunately, a lot of managers misunderstand this to mean that measurement is management, but in reality, performance measurement is just a launching point for effective performance management. I wish we wrote this definition. It was written by the American Productivity and Quality Center, APQC. It's a great definition on benchmarking, and I highlight the points here that this is about improving performance by continuously identifying and understanding and adapting outside practices and processes found both inside and outside of your organization. And, you know, a perfect case of that is Southwest Airlines, which looked at NASCAR and how they turn cars in the different, the pits, so to speak. There were outstanding practices that were emulated, that Southwest emulated, and therefore they still have one of the best turnaround times for their aircraft. So it's an example of an organization that went outside of themselves. They could have looked at other airlines, but they found instead somebody else that was doing a similar practice, and they were doing it very well. The definition goes on to talk about how best practices are the cause of best performance. And that really is key to understanding when you're going to be benchmarking and looking at your metrics, that best practices are critical to that. So it gets us to sort of highlight what we know about all of this, that in order to improve our bottom line, we need to improve our metrics. In order to improve our metrics, we need to improve our processes. And again, these are all points that WERC has considered as we move forward, and we've developed some of the different products and services that we have that I'll be talking to you about today. So how do we know that? How do we know that in order to improve your bottom line? Well, we do an annual study. Some of you may be familiar with it on DC measures, and it looks at 46 different metrics, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail in a minute or two. But when we looked at some of the financial metrics, those companies that were performing at best in class obviously had a lower cost. And so it just goes to underscore again that in order to improve our metrics, we need to improve our processes, which ultimately go to improve the bottom line. The tricky thing about financial metrics, though, is financial metrics are lagging indicators. They will tell you where you're at. They're not going to necessarily tell you where you're going. The canary in the coal mine analogy is fitting for this. It tells you something's wrong, but until the canary dies, you don't know it. And so that's sort of with financial metrics. It's, again, like driving your car by looking in the rearview mirror. It will tell you where you've been, but won't tell you where you're going. So we need to look at metrics that are leading indicators. And there are a lot of metrics out there across a number of associations. And this is a study which I had just mentioned, our annual DC measure study, which we've been doing now for, I think this will be our 13th year doing this. And we cover 44 to 50 different metrics every year. There are definitely some tried and true. But what this all comes down to is looking at making sure that you have a balance between the qualitative, the data, the quantitative, the data that you're collecting, as well as the qualitative, the quality of the processes that you have in place. The benchmarking data is good, but it's not good enough. You need to have that balance. The DC measure study that I talked about, we do in conjunction with an excellent research team. Carl Mandroat, professor of logistics, Donnie Williams, an assistant professor of logistics, both at Georgia College and State University, Joe Tillman with T-Squared Logistics. Our research partner on this particular project is DC Velocity. They're a trade press magazine. If you're not familiar with them, I'd encourage you to do so. They're an incredible partner to work with. Our sponsors for this study are Kronos and Kenco Logistics Services. And in the last 18 months, we began working with a company called Texas, which has licensed a number of the metrics, and they include it in their software for their customers. So what goes into the DC Measure study? Well, a little bit about the demographics of who makes up the study. This gives you an idea of who is reporting the data that gets reported out in our study. And this year we had just over 400 usable responses. The largest group of those participating were managers, followed by directors. What's interesting, though, is we asked them, whom do they report to? And we see here that those that are ultimately getting this information are the senior VPs as well as the C-level board of directors. So this is whom our audience is reporting to. What is the makeup
Michael,
of the group?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I do have a question I'd like to ask. I'm getting through the system here. If you don't mind me reading it to you. 32% of respondents indicated that they report directly to C-level and the board of directors. Is this consistent with previous years, or is it increasing or decreasing?
Good question. There has been a slight change as to whom respondents are reporting to, but the change we've noticed it over the last several years. It's increased, but not significantly enough to make a big deal out of it. But it is something that we are keeping an eye on. It's important to note that we are seeing a slightly larger audience every year that is reporting to the C-level. So it's an indicator that this information is important and is working its way up into the boardroom and at the C-level. Who makes up the study? This is a slide that indicates the different industries that participate in the survey. The largest group are manufacturers, and they are followed by the retailers, and then followed by third party. And this makeup is similar to WERC's audience as well as DC Velocity's audience. So it's not surprising that we're seeing these types of numbers. We also asked the audience to identify themselves by the nature of the work, and the largest is those that do case picking, with broken case picking being the largest percentage of participants. We also asked them to indicate who do they serve, who are their customers. Wholesaler and distributors are the largest group indicated by the audience, followed by the retailers and the end consumers. And then the last demographic that we collect on is company size. And again, you see we had a little bit of an uptick this year in companies over 1 billion participating in the survey, as well as in the 100 million to 1 billion mark as well.
There's another question here, Michael, I'm sorry. Given the demographics you just mentioned, how significant are the differences in the benchmarking data among the various demographics?
We do see some differences when you look at some segments, but they're not very significant. The study itself, besides listing the 46 metrics, also provide definitions as well as the formulas. And where sometimes people will say, well, our industry is different. We distribute widgets, and so therefore we have unique metrics, we have unique data. That's going to be true in some cases, but based on the metrics that we collect, when we look at a measurement like on time is based on your definition of it as it is for other organizations. So for some, it might be within 2 hours of receipt of an order. For others, it might be within 48. And what we're measuring is, are you meeting your definition of on time? So while some of the criteria might be different, ultimately the outcome is reporting whether an organization is on time or not, and that's still based on some of their internal definitions. So while there are some differences between the segments and the demographics, there's not a lot of difference that we're seeing, and nothing that has been significant enough for us to report out on. But good question. popular metrics. That's an interesting slide and interesting data that we've been collecting over the last several years. We ask our participants to indicate the metric in order of popularity, and on-time shipments have been number one for the last few years, at least the last 3 or 4 years. And new, though, to the study this year was number 11, the back orders as a percentage of total orders. That was not in the top 12 in the last 2 years. And we're seeing a shift away from some of the financial metrics, probably because they're a little bit more difficult to collect and to report out on. Most of the metrics are focused on customer and on operations. So here's a sample of what the report looks like and the type of data that we collect. In the far right column is the median, and we report out on the median because that doesn't change much over time, and it helps to eliminate any outliers that might skew the data. The best in class represents the top 20% of the participants' responses. And so when you look at on-time shipments, best in class is greater than or equal to 99.8%. The advantage column represents the top 60 to 80% of those that respond, and you can use that 20% increment all the way down to where we call it a major opportunity if you're less than 96% in hitting on-time shipments. And like I said, for each of the metrics that we report out on, there's a definition of that metric as well as the formula for that metric. So it's something that we've always provided, and in fact, we've worked with other organizations on to develop. I'm not going to go into each metric for time's sake, but the number one metric on time shipment is, I've listed it here. We see that best in class has remained pretty consistent over the last 4 years, 5 years, whereas we do see a bit of an uptick in the median. And this is true for a number of metrics if actually we go through it. And I'm going to give you a link at the end where you can get more details on this. Actually, listen to the presentation from last year's conference that where the presenters and the researchers go into much more depth about the study itself. But generally what it comes down to is if you're staying the same and you're happy about that, it might be a little bit misdirected in that a lot of companies are starting to get better. So in that advantage class, it's getting stronger and getting closer to the best in class. So this has to do, everything I've talked about so far has to do with the quantitative information. And in this organization, we've been asked over the last several years to provide the other component of benchmarking, which is the qualitative. So several years ago, we developed the guide for benchmarking. And I'm going to go through that pretty quickly. There's a lot of information in the publication, but basically what it is our steps to successful benchmarking. And we broke it into 4 different areas or 7 different steps: plan, measure, compare, and act. And again, let me go through those quickly here just to give you an idea, but all this information is in far more detail, and it's available. We've offered seminars on it. We've offered webcast series to get really into the specifics of it. And again, this is as a basis within which to help your organizations come up with a process within which to benchmark. Step 1 is starting out with a vision statement, job 1. Surprisingly, a lot of organizations don't have a vision statement that their teams can rally around. Step 2 is identifying key processes. The best way to do this is to look at your processes and ask yourself which ones have a high impact for our customer and which ones have a high impact on the organization. Those are the processes that you'll want to focus on and will give you the best return if you're able to improve them. Collecting data, huge challenge for a lot of organizations. You can collect data within your organization, within your network, among your customers. You know what on time is. Does it match with what your customer's expectation for on time is? There's formal benchmarking services out there, and there's industry associations. Here's a list of some of the industry associations and the networks out there that you can contact that have data, like WERC does, like what I just showed you. They might also have some different metrics available. Again, a sample. The next step is comparing best in class, and you want to compare the quantitative. So you start pulling data and compare how your data compares to others. But you also want to start comparing the qualitative. How does your process compare? And in conjunction, again, with everything that we've been doing, we developed a set of best practices. We worked with an organization, Supply Chain Visions, and their teams examined the warehouse, and we ended up breaking it down into 8 different areas, 8 different functional areas, which I've listed here. Everything from receiving and inspection all the way through load consolidation. And within each of those, or overall, throughout all those functional areas, we identified 114 different processes and rated each of those processes from poor to best. And it looks something like this. So with inspection, you see where we have a poor practice is no inspection, but a best practice would be inspection that could result in a quarantine and immediate notification. And going back to the guide on how to benchmark, you would take this information and say, okay, we're looking at inspection, this is where we're at, and now we assign ourselves a score. And in this particular example, for inspection, you ended up with a score of 2. You end up coming up with an overall score, which then you put into a bit of a roadmap or a gap analysis. You know where best practice is at because all the best practices have been listed and outlined. And you start to put in where did you score? And then ask yourself how significant are these gaps? And we use the red light, yellow light, green light to indicate those gaps that are most significant to those that are least significant. From there, then you want to start setting your priorities and asking your teams what areas are most important. Ask them to rank what areas are most important. And then you go back and you look at the exercise and say, well, what has the biggest strategic impact for our organization and for our customers? What has the biggest cost impact? Those that have a high impact, those that have a medium impact, and those that have a low impact. And from there, you start to identify the priorities and the areas that you want to focus on. And then it's setting your targets. Where do you want to get to? Best practice might be great, but it may not be what's best for your organization. So your targets might not necessarily be best practice. It might be you want to get it up to a good practice, or you want to at least get it to a common practice. And again, focusing on those areas that are a priority, and then working on a plan to get to those areas. And at the same time, going back and looking at the metrics. Where does your metric falling at, and where do you want to be at? Again, helping to put everything into perspective. And then, of course, it's working on closing the gaps, focusing on those areas that are priorities, and we also recommend setting interim targets. You might want to get to best in class, but maybe your first step needs to be shooting for getting it from an inadequate practice up to a good practice. And we suggest that as a way to engage your team and to keep your team encouraged by meeting perhaps shorter-term goals. Benchmarking has a number of challenges. Penn State identified a number of them in a study that they did a few years ago. Accurate and comparable data is the biggest barrier, and you can see them all listed here. Clear goals for benchmarking, willingness to share, finding the right partners, all of that plays into the challenges of benchmarking, and it's something that WERC has worked very hard at to provide the tools needed to overcome those challenges. That all being said, we did everything that I just talked about, and we thought we were done. But we found that a number of people needed help actually implementing and using those products and services. And so what we did is we developed an assessment and a certification program. And basically what this is we stepped back and we looked at, and we know there's a number of challenges in the industry. Everybody is pulled in a number of directions. All that information's out there, but it's a matter of taking the time to implement it. We know that there's a lot of resources out there. There's the trade press, there's white papers, consultants, you can go on tours, you can see how everybody else does it. What was missing though, and based on the feedback that we were getting, is the industry lacked an unbiased assessment. All of the information that we have is pulled together from the industry. It's the variables that are reported, based on the demographics that I showed you. A lot of that carried over into the research that we did for our best practice guide. And so we look across a number of segments and pulled that all together based on it. So what we ended up doing is we took the qualitative information, the best practice guide that we already put together, we married it with our steps to benchmarking, and we developed the assessment program, which is set up in a way that we actually have an auditor that comes in and goes through the exercise that basically goes through the exercise that I just outlined to you. And so what this looks like is, there's a pre-audit phase to it, and then on site, our auditor comes in and goes through each one of the 114 different processes that make up the best practice guide. And that's all done on day one. On day two, they deliver the results on site to a team. And this is what it looks like. They'll go through each one of the 114 different processes and note where that facility scored, any observations that were made, any feedback based on the team members at the time that they were there doing their audit. One of the fun takeaways is we ask teams, what are your 3 wishes? And that reveals a lot of information about an organization and some of the needs that they might have. When you ask your team members, if you had a magic wand and could change something today, what would it be? And you get some good feedback that way. So we capture all of that information. We compile all of it. We put into that gap analysis that's part of the benchmarking guide, and deliver results that look like this, a gap analysis that show where an organization's strengths are, where its weaknesses are, et cetera.
Michael, here, again, don't mean to interrupt. There's a question that just came through, very relevant. How does the assessment account for processes that, while are, as you refer them to, best in class, might not be widely accepted?
Good question. So RFID, for example, is considered a best-in-class practice. When we do the audit, if you have it, you get points for it. If you don't have it, we don't take away points. It doesn't count. So that's an area that is looked at in terms of, well, it's a best practice. It's not a common practice yet. So that's how we account for that. Getting back to the process itself, the audit itself, so on day one, we do the assessment. On day two, we deliver the results, which I showed you. And we also go through a bit of a process improvement workshop where those slides that I showed you, that detail and in terms of identifying your gaps and closing your gaps and comparing and setting your priorities, is something that we work with the teams on as well. This leads us to, I think, what most groups really appreciate is the rate, rank, and plan, where we go through and we take those opportunities that we identify and we actually put a bit of a plan behind it. The group has prioritized it. They've come up with a plan. They might have assigned it to somebody who's going to be the owner of it within the team, and it makes it closer to being actionable. This was based on feedback that we received from an organization that had done a number of these. We had organizations saying, I need to know what to do next. We used to deliver the results and we were done. But since we don't provide recommendations for specific products or services, we can't implement anything. What we did do is we step back and say, okay, well, let's at least help come up with a plan. And so this is where the assessment helps to get through the first 6 steps of successful benchmarking. And again, looking at the challenges of engaging a team, taking the time, making the time to get it done, the buy-in, et cetera, it's something that helps to, it's a shortcut to it. We also get a lot of feedback beyond the benefits of a particular, of improving a process. Feedback that we've gotten is it's identified processes that have degraded over time through staffing changes, et cetera, over the years. Processes break down. Morale, you're engaging a team, you're asking questions. It's a true comparative. You're comparing yourself against other organizations based on data we've collected from across a variety of segments. It's a differentiator. Oftentimes when companies have come to us first parties along with their third party. Sometimes the third parties are hesitant, but for those organizations that achieve it, they're usually the first that want to be able to leverage it and promote it among their customers and their networks, et cetera. Collaboration, it opens dialogue among a team, whether that's all internal within a company or whether it's between a company and a third-party provider. So it serves a lot of different purposes. A number of companies have participated in it. All of these have maintained the certification program over the years. Overall, we've had about 35 that have participated, and we have a number of companies that participate knowing they won't pass it. That's one of the things that, we'll often get questions saying, well, I know I won't pass this, so maybe I shouldn't do it. And all I can tell you is if you're not going to pass it, you're probably the organization that needs it the most. Again, it's just providing you a gap analysis and a tool and a plan that allows you to move forward. This doesn't replace any product or service that's provided by anybody that's out there. It's just taking information that we have, basically that you really can do yourself, and helping you get through it. Some resources that I mentioned, if you go to werc.org/metrics, you'll find that a link to the presentation from the 2014 conference on the annual metrics study. If you're a member, you can download a copy of the study for free. There's also a link to a white paper there that Texas did on visual metrics. It's a very good white paper. I'd encourage you to take a few minutes to read it. And then the publications that I mentioned are also listed under our facility certification side of it or in our store. Both of them are significantly discounted if you're a member of the organization. They're not all terribly expensive, even if you're not a member of the organization. So I know that I sped through this quickly. I wanted to give you a flavor of what's out there and the kind of information and to some extent the level of detail that we provided in. And so if there's any other questions, I'm more than glad to take them. If we're getting close to running out of time, please still submit your questions. We'll work on getting an answer for you, even if we're not able to answer it on the webcast here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. Great stuff. Again, I'd like to give everyone the opportunity to submit any questions you'd like Michael to answer. Again, we ask you to direct all questions to the host and panelist using the chat or messaging box of the WebEx tool. I have seen a couple of questions come in already. Here's one, Michael. Who has determined the metrics? How do additional metrics, suggestions that is, be recognized for consideration, i.e. turnover, accidents, wage studies, etc.?
We work with the researchers every year. There's sort of a core of 44 metrics. Sometimes we'll add some or take some away based on, what's going on in the industry. We do it based on feedback every year. The study will go out early February, late January. The 2015 survey will be sent out there. And I think there's an opportunity to make suggestions for other metrics, whether they'll be incorporated that year or not. I think one of the things we're doing after this webcast is it's a survey of the webcast, and certainly if you have that type of feedback and you'd like to see a metric included, please feel free to note that or email us separately, and it's something that the researchers will consider adding to the survey. It's quite detailed because it is 46 different metrics, so we are very cautious and very sensitive to people's time in order to complete it. So we are very careful to what gets added to it, but we have added metrics to it over the years.
Okay. Well, I think we are just about time here, and I appreciate everyone who submitted their questions. If we have not gotten around to answering your question, we will be sure to get in touch with you and answer those questions. That's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. If you have additional questions, please direct your questions to Michael's email address, mikitka@werc.org, or by calling 630-990-0001. Once again, thank you for taking the time to joining us today. Have a great day.